Friends, thank you very much for joining us again this week. James, very good to see you.
Good to see you too, Ian. Yep.
You've had a bit of a busy week, I know, but
I have had a busy week. Yeah,
very busy
you're
week. Energized about talking about this.
I'm completely pumped about talking about John 4 and the Samaritan woman, Ian. Yes.
Oh, you've jumped ahead. Oh, that's where we are, isn't it?
Oh, yes, that is where we are, isn't it? Curious.
Why is that? We're in, where are we in? Which week are we?
So this is Lent 3, and it's the passages John 4, 5 to 42, which I think is one of the longest we've ever had.
It is. It's incredibly long. And it's one of this sort of slightly odd intrusion into looking at Matthew's gospel. From 4 episodes in John, 4 encounters of Jesus with John. Now, before we go any further, James, we need to remind our loyal viewers what they need to do.
Yeah, we'd love you to subscribe to the channel, and then you'll get a notification. We'd love you to like the videos if you do like them. That would be great. We'd love you to share them on social media.
Again, you click down below and you get the link and you can post
easy
it.
Easy to do, your preferred social media. And also, if you'd like to make a comment, that would be great. Do that on the YouTube channel or whatever. We'd love to hear from you what your thoughts are.
Now, there might be quite a lot of comments this week, James, because this is such a long reading. I mean, normally we try and sort of go through things sort of verse by verse, but this is such a long reading, we can't possibly do that. So we'll launch off and make a couple of observations, particularly about the opening of the reading. But there are some big questions here, and I've got lots of questions, and I hope you're going to help me because I'm not sure I've got them all resolved. So
no, I'm not sure I have either. But yeah, there are very big questions in this passage, and I think there's an interesting question about whether those difficult to resolve issues actually affect profoundly the interpretation of the passage. Okay, I think that's an interesting. We may get into that, but these things can be a little bit of red herring sometimes, can't they? Do they really impact the overall message that one might communicate?
I'll just pass over the fact you just used impact as a verb there. So
yes, I'm so terribly sorry about that. I apologise for that.
Moving swiftly on
because I'm so pumped up, Ian. You know, I'm impacting everything.
Okay, now down to the reading. The first thing we need to do is just to share what we shared in the previous video as well. So I'm just going to share screen because it gives just quite a helpful comparison so we can see where we are in relation to John 3. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but just a reminder. So folks, if you want to just explore this a little bit more, look at last time's the previous video and where we just talk about it a little bit more. But there's a very clear dynamic here. We have to recognize that the chapter divisions don't belong to the text, but there is a very clear narrative relationship between what we call chapter 3 in the fourth gospel and what we call chapter 4. So again, we just noticed the fact that we've got this striking contrast of places and location. There's an apparent contrast of timing, we think.
Yeah, we do. Potentially.
The person, the interlocutor, the person having a conversation with Jesus is now a woman rather than a man, and a Samaritan rather than a Jew, and that becomes very prominent in the text, of course, doesn't it? Now here's one of the things that we're going to explore. So Nicodemus is socially respectable. The woman at the well, we think very often the common reading is she's a social outcast, but we'll come back to that, won't we?
Yes.
Interesting, though, that Nicodemus initiates his dialogue with Jesus, but Jesus initiates the dialogue with the woman. So And then there's a really interesting, another sort of point of discussion is Nicodemus descends into understanding. And of course, we actually noted last time that in fact, the conversation never resolves because it seems to blend into the gospel writer's own commentary. Now, the woman appears to come to faith, but again, there's a little bit of debate in the commentators about exactly how much she does understand. So we'll explore that as well. And we think probably that the woman looks like she becomes a model disciple. But again, I think that's worth teasing out a little bit, isn't it? So,
But lots of extraordinary parallels, whether those are absolutely spot on or not, or contrast, series of contrasting ideas. And
I've got a little pile of books beside me here. So just for reference, those particular contrasts and the literary style are brought out very much by this. It's an older commentary now, 1993, I think, from Mark Stibbe, the readings on John, but other commentators as well noticed these kinds of things. Now, James, you said that the reading begins in verse 5, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Which is slightly unfortunate. I mean, it's already a really long reading, so we don't want to make it longer.
Yeah, no, indeed. But you do miss a bit of the context, don't you? Because it starts there, and I think the one of the things that you do get quite quickly is apparently an emphasis on and sort of setting up of the question of how does Jacob fit into the story. You know, we hear quite quickly that this is near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and then later on, of course, the woman picks up that theme of Jacob, who was an important figure in the understanding of the Samaritans. Perhaps we ought to say a little bit about the Samaritans as well, just to.
We should, but can I just wind you back a little bit, just to the bit we've missed, because I don't want to spend too much time on this, because obviously we've got the reading to look at, but the fact we get the conflict motif as well at the beginning of the chapter, because it's actually slightly convoluted. Jesus learned that the Pharisees had learned that Jesus was making more disciples than John. So really fascinating insight, which we don't get into the synoptics, about the overlapping and the interweaving of the ministry of John with the ministry of Jesus, so that the ministry of Jesus and the Jesus movement comes out of and then overtakes the John movement. And the prominent mention of baptism, which I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
And really, for an understanding of that, you have to read the synoptics. So yet again, the fourth gospel is assuming our own familiarity. And just one last thing in the bit before the reading, which is because he's traveling, he's left Judea and is heading to Galilee, and it says he had to pass through Samaria. Well, of course, he did not have to pass through Samaria.
No, he doesn't. He could have gone up the Jordan Valley, but he didn't.
He got up the Jordan Valley. So there's this divine necessity. It was necessary for him to do that. So
yeah.
And then we get to Jacob as well. So.
And then we get to Jacob as well, and of course, wells are really important places, aren't they, of encounter in the Old Testament, and often important place of encounter for potential marriage. That's very much a theme that comes out,
because we have the story of Rachel.
We have a story of Rachel, and indeed of others as well, and so. But water, of course, is here as well, and maybe that's flagged up by the whole baptism thing in that bit that we didn't read. What is water doing? And water is a huge symbol in John's Gospel. It's we've already heard a lot of it about it with the wedding at Cana, and we've heard about it through water into wine. We've heard about it in that reading we looked at last week. You must be born of water and the Spirit.
Yeah, we have.
So, and of course, we will come on to the water being used to wash the feet of the disciples. We'll go on to the water that flows from the side of Jesus at the cross. So this idea of water and Spirit are really bound up very closely together.
And what is really fascinating about that is that you're drawing out the symbolic significance. But of course, what this gospel is also doing is taking us back to the cultural reality, because I'm just very struck. If you go through any English village, originally one of the main centers of the village would have been water, the well, or the water supply, or the stream, or the river running through the village. And again, that's where people would have brought their animals for watering. That's where you'd have got your own water. You wouldn't have had running water in your own home. So this is a natural focus and a focus place. And of course, I love the fact that in verse 6, he sits down because he was wearied from the journey. So he's there sitting beside the well. So yet again, we get this fantastic tension in the fourth gospel between, on the one hand, Jesus is this extraordinary wonder worker Messiah person. On the other hand, he's extremely human. Oh, he's walked a long way. He's knackered.
Yes, and he's thirsty. So that
he's thirsty.
Very, very human element. But also, as you say, the whole thing about metaphorical water and literal water becomes the key to the opening part of the dialogue between the woman and Jesus. And I think it's David Ford who offers a comment in his commentary on John, that the Samaritans actually only dealt with the Pentateuch. They didn't
indeed.
And in the Pentateuch, water is almost always used literally. It's not used metaphorically, so that she doesn't naturally have a metaphorical understanding or interpretation of it, which I think might be quite significant, really. And in a sense, Jesus is changing that.
Well, that's really interesting, because in my little pile of books here that I've been looking at, there is a bit of debate about the woman's response in this sort of opening exchange. So, and there are some things which I think are very clear, and there are some things which are very hotly debated amongst the commentators. Now, one of the books I was looking at, which is this one here by Susan Hyland, and it's a little collection of studies of believers in the fourth gospel, characters in the fourth gospel, and she calls them imperfect believers, which is very interesting in itself. But what she says is, that this woman is an ambiguous figure.
Yes.
And there are lots of ambiguities, and there are ambiguities about who she is, but there are also ambiguities about how we make sense of her in the in the story. She says there's a great reversal here in the story of the woman of Jesus and the Samaritan woman, but it's not the familiar one of the excluded sinner graciously offered repentance. It's the story of a woman who is spiritually more astute than the great Pharisee Nicodemus. It's the story of a Samaritan woman whose witness to Jesus brings her whole village to the true worship of God. So there's an and that kind of reversal picks up the parallel we saw between chapter 3 and chapter 4.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Now, a couple of other really interesting things to notice in the first part, the opening sort of exchange. We already noticed that it's Jesus who initiates the conversation.
Yes. Yeah.
Give me a drink. Just notice in verse 8, we have a little very characteristic parenthetical saying by the writer of the fourth gospel. And in English translation, put it in brackets, for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. So he actually offers an explanation of why Jesus is alone, which he hadn't done actually in chapter 3.
No. So it sets the encounter up very starkly in terms of a one-on-one, doesn't it?
It does. It's that cinematic thing again, the zooming in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which we noticed before.
And again, verse 9, you have another little parenthetical explanation.
Yeah.
For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Now, I think there's one thing here we can be absolutely confident about in this story, despite the other ambiguities. So either correct me if I'm wrong or affirm me if I'm right here, that the fact that he is a Jewish man and the fact that she is a Samaritan woman, there's a double, as it were, social barrier which Jesus transgresses.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it might even be, you could almost describe it as a triple barrier, because it's kind of ethnicity, it's religion, it's gender, isn't it? I mean, ethnicity and religion may be similar here, but I mean, I think absolutely, and there's no doubt about that at all. And there's no doubt at all, I think, whatever the ambiguities further down the line are, that this woman is unclean in traditional Jewish terms, isn't she? Yeah. So Jesus is stepping across that boundary. He's not bothered about being infected by her uncleanness, as it were, through his encounter with her. As always in the Gospels, Jesus regards his own righteousness as infecting or potentially infecting the other person. The flow is the other way, if you like.
I think that's a really helpful metaphor to use on this, since we're talking in the fourth gospel using metaphors. I think that's a lovely image that, the traditional view is that, well, I mean, there's a sense in which there's quite a big theme behind the large parts of the sort of the Pentateuch itself, saying that, unholiness is infectious. You've got to keep yourself clean. Whereas here, it's the holiness of Jesus, which actually is infectious. And
yes, and that's profoundly missional for us as Christian people. So it's really important to grasp that.
And then we have, again, a really interesting... Now, this is one point where I think there is commonality between the dialogue with Nicodemus and the dialogue with the woman, where Jesus sort of pushes up the metaphorical register of it, and then she pushes back with a literal response. And this is, again, where some of the commentators differ from one another. So some would say, well, the woman isn't really ignorant. She kind of is toying with him. She knows what he's saying, really, because, water is such an obviously metaphorical thing. But I'm not convinced about that. It seems to me that, he is going spiritual. If you knew the gift of God, you'd ask him and he'd give you this living water. It seems to me that she is responding in a mundane way, saying, hey, how you do this? You haven't got a bucket, the well is deep. Where are you going to get it from? And I guess the one thing we miss is that for us, living water is an implicitly metaphorical statement, whereas, of course, in the Greek here, he's using the phrase living water, what is actually what we would call running water.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So it's not as obvious as it was to them as it is to us. And actually, I think this woman is not untypical. I mean, when one speaks to people about things in metaphorical terms, it's quite common in my experience, especially when you're speaking, as it were, about faith in metaphorical terms, for them to hear things literally and to respond literally. And actually, there's a little bit of not quite understanding to begin with, and then you kind of work it through. But it's not always obvious in faith dialogue, as it were, whether something is literal or metaphorical, because faith is absolutely earthed in reality. God does things, real things in our lives. But it's also something much bigger than that. So that can be quite a common confusion. I don't think it's at all unfamiliar.
No, that's a really interesting observation. Now, in her response, we get another mention of Jacob here, which was already introduced to us.
Yeah.
This is the point where I know a number of folk have said this scene by the well is kind of, and then Jesus mentions her husbands, And so we're getting into a kind of spiritual betrothal narrative. I've never been quite convinced by that, because it seems to me, in the way that the gospel writer tells the story, he's not drawing those sort of betrothal motives out very strongly. I don't know which way you go on that one.
No, it's difficult. I think I probably agree with you. I think the one place where I think there is perhaps something going on is the later on, where he's talking about the worship of essentially the worship of other gods, that were what's Spanish, but worship of other gods by Samaritans was, that's adultery in Old Testament terms, isn't it? Essentially,
yes, okay.
Unfaithfulness is adultery. So that's kind of there in the background. But I like you. I don't think the marriage metaphor is particularly to the fore. I think there's a lot more to be taken in terms of there's quite a tussle going on in this dialogue, isn't there?
Yeah, there is.
I think Joanne Brandt, in her commentary, I don't know if you've got that one there on your stack, Ian. Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Yeah. Okay. She does a really helpful kind of analysis of that, and she definitely brings that to the fore, that there is a sort of tussle for supremacy in the conversation, which is quite it feels quite familiar to us from the fourth gospel's dialogues. So that seems to be, rather than, oh, this is all a big metaphor for marriage. Yes. This seems to me, when she talks about Jacob, it seems to be much more her. For me, it feels much more like her asserting her religious identity over against Jesus's.
Yeah, interesting. But interesting in that very dynamic, the fact that Jesus is prepared to engage with people in conversation here, which again is I mean, he's creating space for the pushback and the misunderstanding and
perfectly able to handle it. One
thing that strikes me about verse 14 is where Jesus talks about the water that I will give will become in the person a spring of water welling up to eternal life. One thing I don't think I've noticed before is that there's quite a strong parallel in language there with that saying in John 7, where Jesus says, whoever believes in me, as the scripture says, living water will come from inside. So there's drawing that parallel with the spirit as the water of life and bringing eternal life.
Yes, and of course that's there's lots of allusions in the Old Testament to that kind of thing. I think Isaiah 12 is perhaps the most obvious one. With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. And in the context of Isaiah, that happens on that day, which is which runs from chapter 11 of Isaiah through to 12. That day being the day of the Messiah, the day of the kingdom inauguration of God's new creation.
The eschatological, the anointed one, the Messiah.
So that's really interesting. That lies very much for me. That lies in the background of this metaphor.
Now, in this next section, so Jesus shifts the conversation completely, which is fascinating. And again, there's one thing which I think is really disputed, but there's a couple of things which I think we can be really confident about. Now, the dispute is around when Jesus says to her, "Go call your husband," and she says, "I have no husband." Then Jesus says, "You are right, I have no husband. You had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. The man you live with now is not your husband. What you said is true." Now, the one big debate is around, and I just not long ago published a really interesting essay on the blog by Chris Knight. I'll put a link in below, where he argues that a lot of the traditional understandings of this passage don't stack up. So he actually questions the time at which this happens. I'm not persuaded about that. He says the 6th hour might be noon, it might be on a different counting later in the day. But one of the things he does challenge is that the traditional reading is the woman is immoral. So somehow she's now shacked up with somebody. She's gone from man to man to man. And he pushes back against that. And I think a lot of commentators do as well. And I think it's very interesting. There are questions around, well, who can divorce? How many husbands can a woman have? And who is this person that she's now living with?
Yeah. And there's nothing in the text to explicitly tell us that she's immoral at all, really. That this could be, as I think Chris points out in his piece, that you could have had, people died young. You could easily have had 5 husbands just through death. You don't even have to include divorce in that.
That's true.
And the man she's living with could well be a relative who is, in fact, because obviously in that situation, that would be, if even some of those husbands had died, that would be a tragedy. It's not at all unlikely that a male next of kin might have taken her in and supported her as part of a wider extended family. So I think there's I'm with him on that, and I don't think it's necessary, as it were, for the understanding of the piece, for her to be immoral. That's just not. We already know she's unclean in Jewish terms, so Jesus already crossed boundaries there.
And again, against that sort of more traditional reading that she's a sinner, there's a sort of pushback on a more, what you might call a more feminist reading, which says that she's the victim because her husband divorced her. Although, again, as you point out, there's no mention of divorce either.
No, there isn't. No.
So perhaps the most we can say from the text is there's a sense of fragility, and vulnerability here.
Yeah, which she accepts, interestingly, doesn't she? I mean, when Jesus says to her, he says, so what you have said is true. When she says, I have no husband, that is an acceptance of some kind of openness and vulnerability to Jesus, isn't it? Yes. Because that's her knowledge, which she shares.
Yeah. But she quickly changes the subject.
She does.
Which is another interesting.
Yes.
So I perceive you're a prophet. So there's a bit of debate. Now, what's undisputed, which I think is really interesting here, is that Jesus's own prophetic insight by the Spirit is giving her, is leading the conversation on. And I know that's something you and I have talked about in other contexts where, I've had experiences, and I know you have as well, where you encounter somebody and then you just sense God is saying something to you about the person or that you want to share, and how significant that can be in terms of a breakthrough into conversation about faith.
Yeah, it's absolutely powerful, isn't it? And indeed, when others do it to us, in terms of ministry, it can be very, very powerful, those little insights. And they are, in some sense, an authentication of the person who's talking to you. And yes. That seems to be what this woman is now bouncing off, as it were. In a sense, I think she's thinking, well, this man's a prophet, so here's an opportunity for me to have kind of an exploratory faith dialogue. And she asks him, she doesn't actually ask him a question. She makes a statement, doesn't she? Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem. Yeah. And it's sort of, okay, so what do you say to that? You're the prophet. Yeah. Is that right? Is that wrong? And she gets the comeback straight from Jesus. And
there's an interesting question here. Is she avoiding the personal subject and sort of switching? Is this a sort of spiritual smoke screen, or is she genuinely interested in this question? But I think there's two fascinating things in Jesus's response. On the one hand, it's uncompromising, where he says, salvation is of the Jews.
Yeah.
So he's not sort of saying, well, this stuff doesn't matter at all. No, but on the other hand, he also says that this dispute is going to be transcended because the hour is coming, and in fact is now here, when the true worshippers will worship the Spirit, worship the Father in spirit and in truth.
Yeah.
So I think what is really fascinating for me about that is that, just on that question of the Jewish, one of the dynamics of the Jewishness of the fourth gospel, which is that Jesus manages here to talk about the moment now, this messianic moment, and this messianic theme is all coming all the way through, means that it transcends our prior assumptions, but it doesn't let go of the Jewishness of salvation.
No, it's really interesting how Jesus does that sort of both and thing there, doesn't? But he doesn't compromise, as it were, on either. And that's very powerful. I mean, I look at this and I think, my goodness, he's right up front with her, isn't he?
Yeah, he is
really up front with her, and he doesn't back off. But of course, the truth is powerful, and that's perhaps one of the things that the writer of the fourth gospel is wanting to explain to us, show us, really, that when the truth is spoken, it has the power to transform lives. And
truth is another one of those key words in this gospel, alongside life and alongside water, where you've got these really key terms to follow all the way through. Again, just comparing this with the previous video and to a discussion about Nicodemus in John 3, I was really struck again reading this narrative, how the woman then says, I know Messiah is coming, Christos. Again, a little explanation for those who aren't, native Hebrew speakers. When he comes, he'll tell me. And then Jesus comes straight out. I am the one, I am he who's speaking to you.
Yeah.
So I'm really intrigued how Nicodemus's conversation with Jesus doesn't get to that moment of Jesus revealing himself. And yet this conversation with the woman, it does very clearly gets to the point of saying, I'm the one.
Yeah. There's something going on, isn't there? It's very interesting to notice that. And I think it's not normally counted in the I am sayings of Jesus in the fourth gospel, is it? This one.
No, it's not.
But it is an ego eimi. I mean, it is an I am.
And it is. It doesn't quite fit in with our numerological structure.
No, it doesn't. But in many ways, it transcends it, because it is essentially I am the Messiah. Yeah. So that's quite something.
Yeah, who speaks to you, he.
Yeah.
We need to keep moving. The disciples come back. We get a little bit of inner dialogue. We know what they think. We're told what they're thinking, but they don't say anything. Now, just a couple of fascinating things I love about the detail here. Verse 28. So the woman left her water jar. Now, a number of commentators point out this is a discipleship move, just as the first disciples, when Jesus called them, they left their nets here. So she leaves the mundane business about which she was going in order to do something in relation to faith. And then another thing I love is we mentioned this dynamic in the fourth gospel last week as well. Come and see, she says. She goes to other people and says, come and see. Now, where have we heard that before?
Of course. Well, first of all, Jesus in John's gospel, actually interesting, but Philip and Nathaniel as well. I mean, so in chapter 1, I think it's 139 and 146. So Jesus starts it off. I mean, it's interesting. I think in John, Jesus starts it off with "come and see,"
invitation,
and then Philip and Nathaniel pick it up and imitate. And here we have it again. So come and see is a really important idea, and that's something that we should think about a lot in our own mission and evangelism, isn't it?
Well, two fascinating things on that. One, well, I think this is where, in terms of this is another ambiguity. So some commentators say the woman is a model disciple. Others say, well, no, she doesn't really understand. Look, she's saying, could this be the Christ? And her faith isn't fully formed. But it seems to me that this phrase on her lips for the gospel writer, this is clearly a discipleship language.
Absolutely.
This missional language. Come and see.
Two
fascinating things about that. One is that in the Church of England, the main problem we have is that we're not invitational.
Yeah, absolutely.
The big difference between churches that are growing and churches that are not growing is in churches that are growing, people go to their friends and their neighbors and their work colleagues and they say, come and see, come along, invite, but we invite them along. And we've done statistical studies of that, and the difference is really obvious. Here's this second really interesting thing, which is that this weekend on BBC Radio Nottingham, there was an interview with Debbie and John Wright, who came to, well, had been in Nottingham before. They met with 6 friends in a living room and they wanted to start a new church. And now, well, the radio said that their church is one of the largest in the country. They've got about 5,000 people connected with it one way or another. But I know very well that when they started out, that part of the reason they grew in the early days was that both of them, Debbie particularly, Debbie Wright, just wherever she was standing at the bus stop. She said, we're starting a new church. Why don't you come along? Come and find out.
That's
she'd be shopping. She'd be in the supermarket and go, come and find out. Come along. Come and see. Exactly the same way. And, that's the fruit of it. It's missional language, isn't it?
Yeah. It makes you wonder why we won't do that very much, and why the people who will do that a lot, few and far between. But I mean, this woman in John 4 does it because something absolutely life-transforming has happened to her. And she's just simply wanting to talk about it and wanting other people to encounter it for themselves. She's just giving it away, isn't she? And
many Samaritans from that town believed. Because of the woman's testimony. Again, here's another fourth gospel word, testimony. Not a big word there. Testimony. It's all about testimony, isn't it? So, and of course, we're not all evangelists, but we all have a testimony.
We do. We all can all bear witness. Yeah.
Now, there's another big chunk here in the middle. I can't believe this really includes this. We've got another whole section here about Rabbi, I have food to eat that you do not know about. And I don't know if we haven't got time to explore this.
I don't think we have.
Huge sort of big theological metaphor again. Well, look, lift your eyes to see that the fields are white for harvest. Again, another connection with the synoptics. So we should pray that the Father will send workers into the harvest. So and just another thing that really strikes me here again is we just need to recognize how radical Jesus's metaphors are. So now, doing the will of God is food that Jesus eats.
Yes.
I mean, that's just such a bizarre metaphor, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It really is extraordinary. Yeah. And the other thing I think I just noticed about this metaphor is that, he says one sows, another reaps. So our testimony is part of a process, but we might not see all of it. So we should never, ever not do something simply because we don't think it will result in immediate fruit, or simply because we're only going to plant or whatever, or whatever. You should always be bearing witness, because that is part of the process, and you might not see the rest of it.
Seize the day, seize the moment.
Absolutely.
James, fantastic. It's really great to chat with you about this. It's such a long passage.
It's so cool, isn't it?
Stuff in there.
That's ridiculous.
But really fascinating things. So, so we're very grateful for having met the Samaritan woman.
Yeah.
She's made us think. Now, just remind me, friends, what do you need to do? You need to click on like. That'd be great if you can do that.
Yeah. Subscribe to the channel.
Subscribe to the channel button there.
Yeah. Share on the social media.
Click and copy the link over.
And do comment.
And see if you disagree with us. That would be fantastic. See what you think about the woman. So, James, thank you very much, friends. See you next time.